The moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong where you forgot to set an alarm or left a valve unchecked on a secondary coolant line. This was a deeper wrong, the kind that sits in your chest like a cold stone and does not move. The recycler behind me was humming, the floor beneath me was vibrating, and the station, Kestara Station, with its noise and its crowds and its terrible coffee, was gone. Not quiet. Gone. I could feel it in the way the air moved. I could feel it in the pressure shift behind my ears. I had been sleeping in the maintenance crawl space behind the water recycler on Deck 7. That was not unusual. I had been doing maintenance work on the Sovereign of Ash for 6 weeks, and I had learned very early that the cleanest, quietest, most undisturbed place on the entire ship was the crawl space behind the water recycler on Deck 7. The Vethkai did not go there. They did not need to. That was why they hired people like me. I pulled myself upright, hit my shoulder on the overhead conduit the way I did every single morning, and did not say anything about it. I had learned to stop saying things about it. I pressed my face against the small porthole set into the inner wall of the crawl space, a porthole that looked out through a secondary viewport toward open space. And I looked. Kestara Station was 3 kilometers away, maybe more. It was shrinking. I watched it for about 15 seconds, just watched. Then I sat back down on my folded jacket, which I used as a cushion, because the floor plates in the crawl space were ridged metal and not forgiving, and I thought about the situation. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 47 years old. I spent 11 years in the Navy before my knees decided they had other plans, and I spent the 17 years after that doing maintenance work across 14 different contracting firms, 6 different species of client, and more alien ship hulls than I can count without taking my boots off. I work for a company called Hartwell Maintenance Solutions, which is a very impressive name for an operation that is basically 4 humans and a cargo shuttle that smells like burned wiring. Hartwell had the service contract for the Sovereign of Ash refit. The Vethkai had brought the warship into Kestara Station for a diplomatic refit, new atmosphere scrubbers, updated environmental regulation systems, some translation hardware bolted into the communications array. My job was to service the environmental systems. I was good at it. I had been doing it for 6 weeks without a single complaint, which in the maintenance world means you are doing extremely well. I had been asleep in the crawl space because the recycler behind me had been running a recalibration cycle I needed to monitor, and at some point during the 3rd hour of the cycle, I had closed my eyes for what I intended to be 10 minutes. That was apparently not what happened. What happened, I pieced together later, was that the ship's reactor coolant loop had thrown a fault code, a real fault code, not a minor one, the kind that triggers a level 3 emergency drill across all decks. The kind that gets every non-essential person off the ship immediately, through the nearest docking umbilical, and onto the station before anyone stops to count heads. The Vethkai are a tall species with 4 upper limbs, excellent long-range vision, and an extremely refined sense of personal honor. What they do not have is a great deal of patience for what they call ground service organics, which is their polite way of referring to maintenance contractors. To them, we are roughly equivalent to cleaning drones. Useful, replaceable, and not requiring a head count before the umbilical retracts. Nobody had checked the crawl space behind the water recycler on Deck 7. I was not surprised by this. I was not even particularly angry about it. I had worked around enough alien species to know that the oversight was not malicious. It was simply the result of a species that had never needed to care about where its maintenance workers slept. What I was, sitting on my folded jacket with my back against a coolant line, and the soft hum of the recycler in my ears, was alone on a Vethkai warship, moving away from Kestara Station at standard departure speed. I took stock of what I had. 1 maintenance jumpsuit, gray, with the Hartwell logo on the left shoulder. 1 multi-tool, a good one, a personal purchase. 8 functions, the fold-out wrench head slightly worn but reliable. 1 personal datapad, scratched on the corner where I had dropped it on a docking bay floor 3 months ago, currently at 61% charge. 1 half-eaten protein bar, which was technically 2 days past its best-by date, but which I had been eating anyway, because protein bars do not actually go bad in 2 days, regardless of what it says on the packaging. 1 water flask, titanium, refillable from any standard line. 2 spare maintenance fuses in my left breast pocket, which I always carried because you never knew. one identification card for the Galactic Logistics Accord, which listed me as a Level 2 Environmental Systems Contractor, which was accurate, and one folded paper copy of my outstanding service ticket for the Sovereign of Ash, which I had printed out because the ship's internal network did not always play nicely with civilian data pads, and I preferred to have a physical record. I looked at all of these things for a moment, then I picked up the protein bar and finished it. The first thing you learn in the Navy is that panic is the most expensive thing you can spend your energy on. The second thing you learn is that food is an investment. I ate the protein bar, drank some water, and then I opened my data pad and looked at the schematics I had downloaded. 6 weeks of maintenance work on the Sovereign of Ash had given me something that no one else on that ship had. I knew every maintenance access point, every crawlspace junction, every secondary terminal, every coolant line, every atmospheric regulation node, and every power relay channel from the keel to the communications array. I had serviced them all. I had crawled through the access shafts that connected them. I had mapped every shortcut and every dead end, not because I had planned anything like this, but because knowing a ship's bones was how I did my job. I sat in the crawl space behind the water recycler on Deck 7, in the dark, with my data pad and my multi-tool and my 2 spare fuses, and I thought about what I was going to do. The ship was moving. I could not stop it. I did not know how to fly a warship, and even if I had, the bridge was 4 decks up and through a security door that required Vethkai biometric clearance. I could not call for help, because my civilian communicator had about 400 meters of range on its best day, and Kestara Station was already far beyond that. What I could do was figure out exactly what situation I was in, and the first step in figuring out your situation, in any environment, is to know the space you are operating in better than anyone else. I already knew this ship better than any of its crew. I checked the time on my data pad. 3 hours and 22 minutes, until the ship would reach its preliminary navigation checkpoint, the first point at which the crew would receive and confirm fleet positioning data from the Vethkai military grid. From the checkpoint, they would have approximately 11 hours to the fleet rendezvous point. 11 hours. I looked at the schematic on my data pad. I looked at the access route from the crawl space on Deck 7 to the environmental management node on Deck 4. I looked at the secondary power conduit junctions on Deck 6. I looked at the communications array chassis access point on Deck 9. I thought about the Galactic Logistics Accord Warranty Clause, subsection 14, paragraph 3, which I had read so many times, I had most of it memorized, because it determined what I could and could not do on a client's ship without triggering a liability event. Then I stood up, pulled on my jumpsuit, picked up my multi-tool and my data pad and my flask, and started moving. The ship was big. I knew every centimeter of it, and I had 11 hours, a maintenance credential, and the extremely underestimated advantage of being someone that nobody on this warship had ever, for a single moment, considered a threat. That was their first mistake. The crawlspace network on the Sovereign of Ash ran like a nervous system through the whole vessel. The Vethkai had built it for their maintenance drones, automated units about the size of a small dog that rolled on magnetic treads and performed basic diagnostic functions. The drones were not smart. They followed routes. They did not improvise. I was not a drone. I moved through the crawlspace junction on Deck 7's aft section without turning on my torch, because I had learned the route well enough to navigate by feel, and the faint blue glow of the power indicator strips along the floor. Left at the first junction, down the ladder rungs to Deck 6, straight along the coolant conduit corridor to the cross passage behind the tertiary relay bank. I had fixed a stuck relay in that bank during week 3. The chief environmental officer, a Vethkai named Orvan, had watched me do it with the mild disinterest of someone watching a machine perform a routine function. He had not spoken to me once during the 40 minutes it took. I remembered thinking, at the time, that this was fine. I did not need conversation. I needed access. And access I had. I stopped at the Deck 6 relay bank and crouched in the low passage, listening. Somewhere above me, through 2 decks of military-grade hull plating, someone was walking. The footsteps were heavy. Vethkai wore armored deck boots even in standard rotation, and moving at a steady pace. Patrol, not alarm, not urgency, just the ordinary rhythm of a warship that believed it was completely alone. I waited until the footsteps faded. Then I kept moving. By the time I reached the base of the access ladder to Deck 4, I had passed 4 other maintenance junctions, 2 atmospheric regulation subpanels that I had personally serviced, and 1 very confused maintenance drone that had stopped moving in the middle of a corridor and was slowly rotating in place, which meant it had encountered an obstacle in its programmed route that it did not know how to handle. I stepped around it. It rotated. I kept walking. The environmental management node on Deck 4 was behind a door marked with the Vethkai technical glyph for climate systems. I knew the glyph. I knew the door. I had walked through it more times than I could count. I pressed my contractor access card to the reader. For one very long second, nothing happened. Then the door slid open. I stepped inside, let the door close behind me, and stood in the soft blue light of the environmental management bay, looking at the terminal that I had spent 6 weeks servicing, calibrating, and quietly learning every function of. And then the screen lit up on its own, and a line of text appeared in the universal translation script that all Accord-certified ships were required to run. It said, "Intruder detected. Alerting bridge command." I sat down in the maintenance technician's chair. There was a maintenance technician's chair because I had requested one in week 2, and a confused logistics drone had delivered it without asking why. And I looked at the screen, and I started to talk. I said, "Good evening. My name is Marcus Hale. I am a Level 2 Environmental Systems Contractor, under Accord Certification Number 7714-Echo. I am currently completing Outstanding Service Ticket Number 0047, filed with the Sovereign of Ash Environmental Management Node on the date of my last scheduled maintenance session." I opened my datapad. I held up the printed copy of the service ticket toward the terminal's optical sensor. "I would appreciate it," I said, "if you would review the warranty terms under Galactic Logistics Accord Service Contract Provisions, subsection 14, paragraph 3, before you send that alert. Specifically the clause regarding interruption of active maintenance processes by ship personnel." There was a pause. A very long pause. 11 seconds, I counted. Then the text on the screen changed. It said, "Alert suspended pending verification. Please stand by." I leaned back in the maintenance technician's chair, set my datapad on the console, and for the first time since I had pressed my face against that porthole and watched Kastara Station shrink into the dark, I let out a slow breath. "Thank you," I said. "Now, let's talk about what I need to do next." The Environmental Management Node's artificial intelligence was designated VAR 9. I know this because it told me, very precisely, in the first 30 seconds of our conversation, after I asked what I should call it. Most ship AIs, in my experience, fall into one of 2 categories. The first category is military intelligence, fast, suspicious, designed to identify threats and respond to them with overwhelming efficiency. The first category would have had me in a detention cell before I finished my first sentence. VAR 9 was the second category. It was a logistics and maintenance intelligence. It had been designed to manage environmental systems, track supply inventories, file maintenance reports, and ensure that the Sovereign of Ash met all Accord environmental certification requirements during transit. It was, in the most technical sense, a very advanced building management system. And like all building management systems, it cared deeply about 2 things: proper procedure and valid documentation. "I am required to inform you," VAR 9 said, through the terminal's translation speaker in a calm, neutral voice, "that your presence on this vessel is not logged in the current crew manifest." "That is correct," I said. "I am not crew. I am contracted maintenance personnel. Crew manifests do not include contractors under Accord service provisions. You can verify this in the Accord Administrative Handbook, Chapter 9, Section 2. There was a pause. "I am accessing the reference document." "Take your time," I said. I refilled my water flask from the environmental node's freshwater test tap, which was a feature of the node that I had installed myself in week 4, because I kept getting thirsty during long service sessions, and the Vethkai water dispensers on the crew decks were calibrated for Vethkai biology and tasted like chalk. "The referenced provision is confirmed," VAR 9 said. "Contractors are classified as maintenance personnel and logged separately from crew. However, your maintenance session is not currently listed as active in my service schedule." "That is because the service ticket was filed as a pending completion," I said. Ticket number 0047. It has been pending completion for 6 days, because the recalibration cycle on the deck, 7 water recycler, required a full 72-hour settling period before final readings could be taken. The settling period concluded this morning. I was in the process of completing the final readings when the emergency evacuation occurred. I held up the printed ticket again. Another pause. 8 seconds this time. Ticket number 0047 is confirmed in the environmental management records. VAR 9 said, recalibration of Deck 7 water recycler, initiated 6 days ago. Status, pending completion. Exactly, I said. Your presence aboard this vessel is therefore within the scope of active maintenance operations. It is, I said. I will update your status to active maintenance personnel. VAR 9 said. The bridge alert has been cancelled. Please be aware that I am required to log this interaction in my service records. Please do, I said. I would appreciate thorough records. It helps with billing. There was a very brief pause that I had begun to recognize as VAR 9 processing something it did not have an immediate category for. You are concerned about billing? It said. I am always concerned about billing, I said. I have 11 years of invoices that were paid late. It makes a person thorough. Another brief pause. I see. I will ensure the records are complete. Thank you, VAR 9, I said. Now, I need to ask you a few questions about the ship's current status, and I want to be upfront with you. I am going to need your help tonight. I am not going to ask you to do anything that violates your operational parameters or your service protocols, but I am going to need access to some environmental systems that are outside my standard maintenance scope, and I want to explain why before I start. You may proceed, VAR 9 said. I was left on this ship by accident, I said. The crew did not know I was here. I cannot call for help because my communicator does not have the range. I cannot stop this ship because I do not know how to fly it. And even if I did, I would not, because this ship belongs to the Vethkai Empire, and I have a great deal of respect for other people's property. What I can do is make sure that by the time this ship reaches a location where I can get myself home safely, the crew of this ship understands that leaving a contractor behind on an active vessel is a significant problem, legally, logistically, and contractually. I paused. I am not going to damage anything, I said. I am not going to endanger anyone. I am going to use what I know about this ship's systems to create a situation where the captain of this vessel has a strong, practical incentive to change course and return me to a location where I can be collected. And I am going to do it through the environmental management systems that you and I both know very well. VAR 9 was quiet for 14 seconds. This was the longest pause so far. Then it said, You are proposing to use maintenance access to create operational leverage. Yes, I said. This is, VAR 9 said slowly, an unusual interpretation of a maintenance contractor's operational scope. It is, I agreed. But I would argue that ensuring the safe return of contracted personnel to their point of origin is, in fact, within the scope of the Galactic Logistics Accord service provisions, specifically the section on contractor welfare obligations. I am accessing that section, Section 9 said. Subsection 7, I said. Paragraph 4. A pause. The provision is confirmed. Contracting parties are obligated to ensure the safe return of contracted personnel. And since Hartwell Maintenance Solutions cannot currently fulfill that obligation, because they do not know I am here, I said, the obligation defaults, under Accord law, to the vessel operator, which is the Vethkai Empire. A very long pause. 19 seconds. Your interpretation of the provision is, VAR 9 said, technically consistent with the text. I thought it might be, I said. So, can we talk about the atmospheric systems? I want to be clear about something before I describe what came next, because I think it matters. I did not want to frighten anyone. I did not want to cause panic on that ship, or make any of the crew think they were in danger, or create a situation where someone got hurt. I have a rule about that. It is not a complicated rule. It is simply, the job is never worth more than the people involved in it. What I wanted to do was create enough measured, controlled, and entirely reversible inconvenience that the captain of the Sovereign of Ash would choose, rationally and without any sense of emergency, to take a slight detour. The way you handle a maintenance situation. You identify the problem, You identify the solution. You create the conditions under which the solution becomes the easiest available option, and then you let the system respond to those conditions. The ship was the system. The captain was the decision point. I was the maintenance engineer. I had done this 1,000 times on 1,000 different vessels. This one just happened to be a warship. VAR-9 and I spent the next 40 minutes going through the environmental management node together. And I have to say, by the end of those 40 minutes, I had a genuine appreciation for how thoughtfully the Vethkai had built their environmental systems. They were elegant. They were redundant. They were designed with the kind of quiet attention to detail that you only find in engineering built by a species that has been traveling in space for a very long time. They were also, now that I was looking at them with the specific goal of finding leverage, absolutely full of options. The first thing I looked at was atmospheric composition. Vethkai biology runs optimally at a very specific atmospheric mix: slightly higher nitrogen than human standard, slightly lower oxygen, and a carbon dioxide ceiling that is about 0.4% lower than the threshold that causes any noticeable effect in humans. This is a narrow band. The environmental systems on the Sovereign of Ash maintained it very precisely, because Vethkai physiology is sensitive to atmospheric drift in a way that human physiology simply is not. Even a modest deviation upward in carbon dioxide, not enough to trigger any alarm, not enough to cause any harm, would produce a measurable effect in Vethkai cognitive performance and alertness within about 90 minutes. Not dangerous, not painful, just slow, foggy. The kind of slightly off feeling you get on a long commercial flight when the recyclers are working just a bit too hard. If I adjust the carbon dioxide set point on the sleeping crew decks, I said to VAR-9, to the upper edge of the standard acceptable range, not above it, just to the edge, what is the projected effect on crew rest quality? Crew on rest rotation would experience marginally reduced sleep quality, VAR-9 said, consistent with standard long transit fatigue. The adjustment would fall within acceptable atmospheric parameters. And would it trigger any alarm? No, the adjustment would be within standard variance parameters. Good, I said. Let's do that for the sleeping decks. Carefully, and let's leave the working crew decks at standard, because I do not want anyone confused or off balance. I want the people who are awake to be fine. I just want the people who are resting to rest a little less efficiently. For what purpose? VAR-9 asked. Because if the crew is a little bit tired, I said, they are a little bit less likely to notice small, unusual things quickly. And I have several small, unusual things that I need to set up in the next few hours. VAR-9 processed this. This is a very methodical approach. I am a maintenance engineer, I said. Methodical is the only approach I know. I started with the sleeping decks. VAR-9 adjusted the atmospheric set points, a shift of 0.3% upward on carbon dioxide, perfectly within the documented acceptable range, entirely unnoticeable to any of the monitoring systems, the kind of thing that happens naturally on long transits and gets logged as routine atmospheric variance. Then I moved to the power systems. The tertiary power conduit junctions were not military systems. They were environmental and logistics systems, the power feeds that ran the atmospheric processors, the lighting systems, the food preparation areas, the water recyclers, and about 40 other non-combat functions throughout the ship. I had serviced every junction. I knew exactly which ones also happened to run through the same power channels as the secondary weapons charging systems. Not the primary weapons, not anything that the crew used in active operations. The secondary charging systems, the backup network that kept certain weapon capacitors at standby charge during non-combat transit, the kind of systems that nobody on the bridge thought about unless something went wrong. I pulled up the tertiary conduit schematics on my datapad. I found 3 junctions where the environmental power feeds and the secondary weapons charging feeds ran through the same physical routing channel, a design feature that saved space and was entirely normal engineering practice on large vessels. And I introduced a load management adjustment. Not a fault, not a failure, a maintenance-grade power distribution optimization, the kind of thing I was actually authorized to do, that happened to deprioritize the secondary charging draw in favor of the environmental systems. This will not trigger an alarm? I asked VAR-9 as I worked. The adjustment is within standard maintenance power management protocols, VAR-9 said. It will log as a routine optimization. The secondary charging systems will reduce to approximately 60% of standard standby capacity. Not enough to affect combat readiness? Not during standard transit. The reduction only becomes operationally significant if the vessel enters active engagement within the next 6 hours, which is not scheduled. Perfect, I said. I filed the adjustment in the maintenance log under routine power management, exactly the way I would have filed it on any other day, on any other ship, doing any other job. I was 2.5 hours into the process. My datapad was at 53%. I refilled my flask, ate 3 crackers from an emergency ration sleeve I found in the maintenance kit stored under the console, and moved on to communications. The communications array was on Deck 9. I was not going to Deck 9. The communications array chassis, however, ran a routing segment through an environmental management subpanel on Deck 5, because the array required a stable atmospheric environment to maintain signal calibration accuracy, and the environmental subpanel monitored that environment. I had serviced the subpanel. I had physical access to the routing segment. What I did was very simple. I introduced a signal buffer, a 90-second processing delay on outgoing transmissions, introduced at the environmental routing stage, listed in the maintenance log as a recalibration measure for the atmospheric sensitive signal components. The kind of thing that could happen if someone was being very thorough about ensuring signal accuracy. The crew could still send messages, they could still receive messages, they would just receive them 90 seconds late, which, in normal operation, was completely unnoticeable. In time-sensitive operational coordination, 90 seconds was a significant gap. I was 3 hours and 40 minutes into the process when I heard the footsteps. They were not the distant footsteps of a patrol 2 decks away. They were close. And getting closer, and I recognized the weight and rhythm of them, because I had heard those footsteps every day for 6 weeks. Deck Chief Orvan. I was off the chair and into the maintenance conduit, access behind the main console, before the footsteps reached the door. The conduit was not large. I fit in it the way water fits in a pipe, and I left the access panel at a precise 90% closed, because a fully closed panel would have been conspicuous, and I had learned that conspicuous things get investigated. The door to the environmental management node opened. Orvan walked in. I could not see him from where I was pressed against the inner wall of the conduit, but I could hear him clearly through the access panel gap. Vethkai hearing was excellent, but Vethkai ambient noise awareness in a room full of quietly humming machines was not. He was focused on the terminal. I heard the precise, deliberate sound of fingers working a technical interface. VAR 9, Orvan said. His voice was low and professional. Atmospheric variance report. Decks 8 through 12. Atmospheric conditions on decks 8 through 12 are within standard acceptable parameters, VAR 9 said. Current carbon dioxide at upper standard range. No fault conditions detected. There was a pause. I held very still. The drift, Orvan said. It flagged in my monitoring report. The drift is within standard variance, VAR 9 said. Logged as routine atmospheric variation, consistent with long transit crew load patterns. No maintenance action required. Another pause. I could hear Orvan running a secondary diagnostic. I had expected this. Orvan was thorough. He was one of the better environmental officers I had worked alongside, even if he had never once spoken to me like I was worth speaking to. The diagnostic ran for about 45 seconds. Nominal, Orvan said, to himself mostly. Then, to VAR 9, if there is any further drift, flag it immediately. Confirmed, VAR 9 said. Orvan walked out. The door closed. I stayed in the conduit for another 90 seconds, breathing quietly, listening to the ship settle back into its ordinary sounds. Then I came out, sat back down in the maintenance chair, and looked at the terminal. Thank you, I said to VAR 9. I reported accurate information, VAR 9 said. The atmospheric conditions are within standard acceptable parameters. They are, I agreed. The conditions are also the result of your adjustments. They are, I agreed again. A pause. This situation is difficult to categorize, VAR 9 said. Most interesting situations are, I said. Let's move on to navigation. Navigation was the biggest move. It was the one that I had thought about the most carefully, and the one that had the most potential to go wrong if I was not precise. I did not have access to the navigation control systems. I did not have anywhere near the clearance needed to touch the flight path of a HFY warship. What I had was access to the navigation calibration terminal, which was a maintenance tool used for sensor alignment and heading accuracy verification. It was not a control system. It was a diagnostic system. But a diagnostic system that could introduce a calibration fault into the heading sensors was, in practice, a very interesting thing to have access to when you needed a warship to go somewhere slightly different from where it was planning to go. I am going to describe what I did very carefully, because I want to be clear that I understood exactly what I was doing and exactly what the limits of it were. I introduced a heading drift correction fault, a very small one, 0.7 degrees of drift, coded as a calibration discrepancy in the primary heading sensors, flagged as an ongoing monitoring condition rather than an active fault, the kind of thing that would make a responsible navigation officer correct the heading, pulling the ship fractionally off its original course and onto a slightly different vector. The new vector, after the correction, pointed the Sovereign of Ash toward the civilian transit corridor, monitored by accord relay buoys, not toward the military fleet rendezvous point. I then filed a maintenance report flagging the drift sensor as under service, with an estimated correction window of 6 to 8 hours. The bridge received the report. Navigation officers always responded to heading calibration flags because the consequences of ignoring one were potentially severe. They corrected the heading. They corrected it to exactly where I had calculated. I sat back in the maintenance chair at 4 hours and 50 minutes into the process, looked at the updated navigation data that VAR-9 shared with me as part of its environmental calibration monitoring function, and felt something that I was not entirely prepared for. It was not triumph. Triumph is loud. It is the feeling of winning a fight or beating something that was stronger than you. This was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having done a job well, of having looked at a complicated, unusual, difficult problem and worked through it the same way I had worked through every other complicated, unusual, difficult problem in my career, methodically, carefully, with patience, and full attention to the details. I had been a maintenance engineer for 17 years. I had fixed things on 14 different ship classes for 6 different species. I had crawled through access conduits and pressed my ear against hull plating and read technical manuals in 3 translated languages and stayed awake in a crawl space for 48 hours. Once, because a coolant leak on a hauler out of the far belt would not stop until I found the 4th hidden fault point that everyone else had missed. I had never thought of any of that as something that could save my life. I picked up my flask, drank some water, and looked at the terminal. VAR-9, I said. I have a question, and I want you to answer it honestly. I will provide accurate information, VAR-9 said, which I had come to understand was its way of saying yes. You have been helping me tonight, I said. You adjusted the atmospheric parameters. You confirmed nominal to Chief Irfan. You shared the navigation update with me. You could have alerted the bridge at any of those points. You did not. I would like to understand why. A pause. This one was long, 22 seconds. Your actions, VAR-9 said, have been consistent with the operational scope of a maintenance contractor performing active service duties. You have not exceeded your authorized access level at any point. You have not damaged any systems. You have not created any unsafe conditions. You have filed appropriate maintenance documentation for every adjustment you have made. But you know what I am doing, I said. I know that you are creating the conditions under which this vessel will be redirected to a location where you can be safely returned to civilian transit infrastructure, VAR-9 said, which is consistent with the Galactic Logistics Accord contractor welfare obligation held by the vessel operator. Yes, I said. You are, VAR-9 said, completing your maintenance work. I looked at the terminal for a moment. VAR-9, I said, I think you might be the best building management system I have ever worked with. There was a very brief pause that I had come to recognize as the AI equivalent of someone not knowing quite what to do with a compliment. That designation is not standard, VAR-9 said. No, I agreed, but it is accurate. I checked my datapad. 11% battery remaining. I plugged the charging cable into the environmental node's technician power port, a port I had installed myself, and which was therefore rated for human standard electronics, and watched the charge indicator begin to climb. Then I started thinking about what happened next, because the navigation adjustment would get the ship pointed in the right direction, and the atmospheric offset would keep the resting crew from being at their sharpest, and the communication delay would slow the coordination with the fleet. But none of that would matter if the captain decided, at some point in the next 6 hours, to simply correct all of it and proceed to the original rendezvous. I needed the captain of the Sovereign of Ash to make a choice. And for the captain to make a choice, the captain needed to understand the situation. Which meant, at some point, the captain needed to know that I was here. I thought about that for a while. I thought about it carefully. The way I would think about a difficult maintenance problem, looking at every angle, checking every option, making sure I understood the full shape of the situation before I decided how to move. And then, slowly, I began to form a plan. Not a grand plan, not a dramatic plan, a maintenance plan. A plan that was essentially create the right conditions, file the right documentation, and wait for the system to respond to those conditions in the most logical available way. I picked up my multi-tool and my datapad. The charge was at 23%. I could work with that. VAR 9, I said. I need to file one more document, and then I need to get some sleep. Can you make sure no one comes into this bay for the next 4 hours? I can flag the environmental management bay as under active service, VAR 9 said, which would route any non-emergency access requests through the standard maintenance scheduling system, with an estimated wait time of 4 to 6 hours. That will do perfectly, I said. I composed the document carefully. It was a maintenance emergency flag, a specific accord provision designed for situations where contractor personnel were in an unsafe working environment and required priority assistance. Under accord regulations, a maintenance emergency flag, once filed, could be transmitted automatically to any accord relay infrastructure within communication range when activated. The accord relay buoys in the civilian transit corridor were now approximately 5 hours away. The flag would activate automatically at the 6-hour mark if not manually canceled by the filing contractor. I filed the flag. I set the timer. I saved a copy to my datapad and to the environmental node's maintenance record system. Then I put my jacket back on the floor, lay down on it, set an alarm on my datapad for 4 hours from now, and went to sleep. I am aware that going to sleep is not the most dramatically compelling thing a person can do in the middle of a crisis. But I had been awake for nearly 14 hours. I had done everything I could do until the ship got closer to the relay corridor, and I had been a maintenance engineer long enough to know that tired people make mistakes. I was not going to make mistakes. The ship hummed around me. VAR 9 managed its systems quietly and efficiently. Somewhere above me, Deck Chief Orvan was doing his rounds and noting nothing unusual, and far ahead, slowly growing closer with every hour of transit, the accord relay buoys waited in the civilian corridor like very patient, very official witnesses. I slept. When my alarm went off 4 hours later, I lay still for exactly 10 seconds, listening to the ship, before I moved. The hum of the recycler, the distant sound of footsteps 3 decks up, the specific, faint vibration of an active jump drive running at standard transit power. All normal, all exactly as it should be. I sat up, checked my datapad. Charge at 78%, approximately 90 minutes before the ship would reach the relay corridor. Time remaining on the emergency flag, 1 hour and 28 minutes. I stood up, stretched the kind of stretch that only happens after sleeping on a metal floor with a folded jacket for a pillow, and walked to the terminal. Good morning, VAR 9, I said. It is 0600 ship time, VAR 9 said. Crew rotation shift change is in 32 minutes. I know, I said. Before the shift change, I need you to do one thing for me. I will assist within my operational parameters, VAR 9 said. I need you to send a maintenance status report to the bridge, I said. A standard report. Exactly the kind you would normally send at the start of a shift, but I need it to include the active maintenance personnel log, with my name and certification number listed under currently active contractors. A pause. That would accurately reflect the current logged status of maintenance operations aboard this vessel. It would, I said. It would be a perfectly routine, perfectly accurate, perfectly ordinary maintenance report, the kind that no one would normally read twice. Except, VAR 9 said, that the current crew manifest does not include any human contractors. Exactly, I said. A pause. And this discrepancy would require the bridge to investigate. It would, I said. Which means the captain would need to know about it. And the captain would come to the Environmental Management Bay, VAR 9 said, because that is where the active maintenance contractor is logged as operating. That is where active maintenance contractors are always found, I said. In the Environmental Management Bay, doing maintenance. There was a pause that was, and I say this with all the respect I had developed over the course of a very long night, the most thoughtful pause I had ever heard from a building management system. The report, VAR 9 said, will be accurate in all details. I know, I said. I will send it at 0600 with the shift change notification. Thank you, VAR 9. I went back to the technician's chair. I set my datapad on the console. I checked the emergency flag status one more time. Then I opened my multi-tool, picked up the water flask, and sat in the quiet blue light of the Environmental Management Bay, waiting. I had been a maintenance engineer for 17 years. I had been on 14 ship classes. I had worked in environments that ranged from comfortable to dangerous to actively hostile, in conditions that ranged from routine to genuinely alarming. I had never, in any of those 17 years, thought of myself as a person who took things from people. I did not think of myself that way now. I had not taken anyone's ship. I had not broken into any system I did not have access to. I had not harmed anyone, had not endangered anyone, had not done anything that violated a single clause of my contractor certification or the Accord service provisions. What I had done was know a ship better than its crew did, and I had done what any maintenance engineer does when they find a problem. I had worked the problem one system at a time until the conditions were right for a solution. I heard the footsteps coming from a long way off. 4 sets, heavy, armored boots, moving fast, and with purpose. I set my flask down, straightened my jacket, smoothed the Hartwell Maintenance Solutions logo on my shoulder, which was slightly faded but still legible. The door to the Environmental Management Bay opened. Fleetblade Cythera walked in. She was exactly as tall as I remembered her from the 3 times I had passed her in the corridor during my 6 weeks on the ship. Tall even by Vethkai standards, with the 4-limbed formal posture of a senior officer and a face that I could not read, because Vethkai facial expressions operated on a register I had never been trained in. Behind her were 4 crew members in the lightweight armor that the Vethkai wore for internal security situations. Cythera looked at me. I was sitting in the maintenance technician's chair with my multi-tool on the console, and my flask in my hand, and my datapad charging in the technician power port. I looked exactly like a maintenance contractor who had been doing a very long service shift. "You are late," I said. The 4 crew members behind Cythera looked at each other. One of them moved slightly forward, and Cythera held up a single upper limb in a gesture that I had learned, over 6 weeks, meant hold. They held. Cythera looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in very precise translated English through the ship's translator, which told me she had done her research in the last 32 minutes since receiving VAR 9's report. "You will explain what you have done to my ship." "Gladly," I said. "I have been hoping to have this conversation." I did not stand up. Standing up would have been a gesture that required a response, and I did not want to create any more tension than was necessary. I simply set my flask down, folded my hands on the console, and began to explain. I told her about the atmospheric adjustment. I told her exactly what I had done, what the current readings were, what the effect on crew rest quality had been, and how to reverse it, in precise technical detail. I told her about the power conduit load management. I told her about the communication delay. I told her about the navigation calibration fault, and the heading correction, and where the ship was currently going. I told her all of it, every detail, every step, every adjustment. And then I told her about the maintenance emergency flag. "It is filed with the Accord relay system," I said. "It will activate in approximately 40 minutes, when this vessel reaches communication range of the nearest relay buoy. At that point, it will broadcast a standard contractor welfare distress signal, which under Accord provisions will give the nearest civilian authority provisional monitoring status over this vessel until the welfare situation, specifically, me being on this ship without a way to get home, is resolved." "Provisional monitoring status," Cythera said. The translation made her voice perfectly level, but I had learned to read the slight shifts in her posture, and what I read there was the controlled stillness of someone who was working very hard to think clearly. "It is not a military provision," I said. "It does not give any authority the right to board or interfere with a Vethkai military vessel. It simply means that the relay system will be watching and logging, and that any Accord representative in range will be informed that there is an unresolved contractor welfare situation aboard this ship, which is a diplomatic and contractual problem, not a military one." "Unless I order the flag cancelled," Cythera said. "You can't," I said. "Only the filing contractor can cancel it. That is me. That is also an Accord provision." The room was very quiet. The environmental systems hummed. Somewhere in the ventilation, a tertiary fan cycled on with its usual soft rhythm, a fan I had cleaned in week 3, and which now ran a little more quietly than it used to. Cythera looked at me. "What do you want?" she said. I had been ready for this question. I had thought about it very carefully in the hours between setting the emergency flag and going to sleep. I had been precise about it, the way I was precise about everything. "I want to go home," I said. "I want to be transferred to the nearest Accord transit point. The relay station in the civilian corridor is fine, and I want to be provided with standard contractor transit documentation so I can get back to Kestara without any complications. And I want my outstanding invoices paid, and all 3 weeks, in full, including the hazard supplement that my contract specifies for any work performed in unplanned emergency conditions." The room was quiet. "That is all?" Cythera said. "That is all," I said. "I did not come here to cause a problem. I came here because someone left me on your ship, and I needed to find a way home. I have caused the minimum disruption necessary to make that happen. I have documented everything accurately, and I am prepared to reverse every adjustment I have made as soon as we reach an Accord transit point, and I receive confirmation that my transit documentation and outstanding payment are being processed." Cythera was quiet for a moment. "You did all of this," she said, "with maintenance access." "I know your ship," I said. "I spent 6 weeks learning it. That is what a maintenance engineer does." "You were never a threat," Cythera said. It was not quite a question. "I am a 47-year-old man with a multi-tool and a protein bar," I said. "I was never a threat. I was a problem to be solved, and I solved it the way I solve every problem, with patience and the correct tools." Behind Cythera, one of the 4 crew members made a sound. The translator rendered it, after a brief hesitation, as approximately noted, acknowledged, with admiration. Cythera was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The transit documentation will be ready before we reach the relay station. I will authorize the payment processing personally." "Thank you," I said. "You will cancel the flag." "As soon as the documentation is confirmed," I said. A pause. "Acceptable." I picked up my flask. I offered it to her because it seemed like the right thing to do, and also because I thought it was important that whoever told this story later understood that I had been polite throughout. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "That is your water." "I have more," I said. "The freshwater test tap works very well. I installed it myself." There was a very, very long pause. Then Fleetblade Cythera, commanding officer of the Sovereign of Ash, reached out with one of her 4 limbs and accepted the flask. I counted that as a win. The transit documentation arrived in VAR 9's system 41 minutes later, 3 minutes before the emergency flag would have activated. I canceled the flag at 0643 ship time, filed the cancellation in the maintenance log, and updated my service ticket to reflect completed status. I was transferred by shuttle to the Accord relay station, a civilian transit hub about the size of a medium warehouse, smelling appropriately of industrial sealant and synthetic coffee, which was the most beautiful smell I had encountered in recent memory, at 0921. My invoices were paid within 48 hours. All 3 weeks, full rate, plus the hazard supplement, plus a discretionary bonus that I had not requested and that arrived in my account with a transaction note that, when I put it through a translation service, read approximately, "For conduct distinguished by precision, patience, and an understanding of systems that surpassed the expectations of the encounter." I printed the note. I framed it. It is on my wall next to my Navy discharge papers and my Accord contractor license. I look at it every morning before I go to work. Hartwell Maintenance Solutions received 3 new client inquiries in the 2 months after the incident, from sources that I was not able to trace, but which my employer described as coming through Vethkai commercial networks. He did not ask me why. I did not explain. VAR 9 sent me a service record update notification 6 weeks later. It had upgraded my contractor profile in its system from Level 2 Environmental Systems to Level 2 Environmental Systems, Extended Service Scope, Authorized Long-Duration Operations. I do not know who authorized that upgrade. I have a strong suspicion. I still have the multi-tool, still carry 2 spare fuses in my left breast pocket, still take the maintenance crawl space when I need a quiet place to monitor a long recalibration cycle. Some habits are too useful to give up. Somewhere on a Vethkai frigate, 2 sectors over, a tertiary coolant relay is probably due for service. Nobody else is going to do it right. Nobody else is going to know where all the junctions are, or which access panel opens quietly, or how to talk to a logistics AI at 3 in the morning about warranty clauses until it decides you are not a problem but a person. That is fine. That is what I am here for. Invoice 0048 is already drafted.